We're ready? Okay. Welcome tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Tending the Herb Garden with Linda Conroy. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can put them in the chat. So Linda comes to us from Stoughton, and other places as well. And this is the third class in the series. Next month we will be talking about putting up your herbs. And so I think that's all I have to say. Thank you and welcome.
Great, thank you for having me. So welcome everybody. This is, as you said, it's the third workshop in a series on herb gardening. And this workshop is on tending the garden. And that's what we're doing right now. We're tending the garden. We've planted a lot of things. We propagated in the greenhouse. You can see on my cover slide here, I have a picture of my greenhouse. We grew a lot of seeds there. And then, of course, after we propagated them and we had more plants than we possibly knew what to do with, then we had to put them out in the garden. And we've done that. And now it's time to be tending them. So, and just to let you know, my website is moonwiseherbs.com. So if you have questions in the future, or you want to learn some other things, or look at my media page and learn a little bit more, you can go there and visit. But with tending the garden, so when I was thinking about this and putting this PowerPoint together, one of the things that I found really interesting to think about as I was doing this is that you need to think about you tend different aspects of the herb garden differently. So depending on what the habitat is. So one of the things you're going to see in this presentation is that I'm talking about the forest garden, where we might have understory herbs, and then I'm talking about the prairie, where we might have prairie herbs like Echinacea, and then the garden herbs, like the more culinary herbs. So how do you tend each of those aspects of the garden? Because they're different. They're not the same ecosystem, so they have different requirements as you're tending them. So you'll see that throughout the presentation. And so depending on what your garden looks like, you might have some different questions about what your habitat is. Also, one of the other things I looked at is raised bed gardening, because I do a fair amount of raised bed gardening as well. So, of course, planting is the first piece, and we've always wait in this region. It's always recommended that we wait until just after Mother's Day to start planting, because you want to plant after the last frost. You don't want your plants to freeze. So, we've just, for the past couple weeks, we've been planting things. And so that's the fun part, is putting them in the ground. It's really gratifying to see them after they've been propagated and growing into starts, and then get them into the ground. And then, and herbs, one thing to know, herbs, no matter where you plant them, are fairly forgiving, which is really fun, because they really are hardy and they tolerate a lot of different environments, most herbs. Most herbs like sun, but some like shade, especially the forest herbs, so we'll talk about those. And once you have them in the ground, and then you need to think about, you're watching them, then you need to think about, well, how do I take care of them when all these other weeds might be growing up? And by the way, I'm a wild forager, so typically I really harvest my weeds. I eat them, I incorporate them into my diet, so I see them as herbs. I don't see them as weeds. So I know a lot of people would think chickweed is a weed, or lamb's quarter is a weed, or something like that. So I often am picking things that other people may not consider herbs, but I do consider them to be herbs. Hello, welcome. So one of the first places that we're propagating herbs is in this spiral garden. And when I talk about herbs, I love to talk about spiral gardens because they're just really fun, and they've become really popular in the permaculture movement. And the spiral garden gives you the opportunity to grow shady herbs. So you grow the shady ones in the back, and you grow the herbs that need a little bit more drainage on the top. And so when you're planting, you think about those things. Who would rather be in the back, and who could be up top? Like rosemary and sage are up top because they really need good drainage. I have borage here in the front. Borage really likes the sunny spot. And so this garden goes around, and it really accommodates in that small space a lot of different habitats. And then it's a really nice culinary kitchen garden. You can go and pick. We have thyme in here, and sage, and rosemary, and calendula, which is a flower that's both edible and medicinal. We have borage, which is an edible flower and also a medicinal flower. So we have a lot of different plants in here, and the spiral allows for accommodating that. Now I'm going to talk about this a little later again, about how mulching this, because that's an important part of tending the garden is mulching. But I'll talk about that a little later. So right now I'm just talking mostly about habitat. And so one of the other habitats where we see a lot of medicinal herbs are in prairie gardens. And this is a prairie garden we actually installed last year at my house on my farm. And we prepared it. So you can see the bed is all prepared. We tilled it, and then we broadcast the seed. And we had, like here we have a Rudbeckia. We have Echinacea growing in there. We have Monarda and bee balm. And so last year we had a lot of flowers. And then this year we have flowers, but we mostly have red clover. And so what's happening there now is the red clover, and I'll talk about this a little later, acts as a green manure. And so it's actually nutrifying, adding nitrogen to the soil. So these beds, when I'm tending them, they have different incarnations. So this was a prairie garden last year just to get it established. This year it has a green manure on it. And next year we'll mow it, and we'll bring back some more prairie plants. So one of the things when you're tending the herb garden, it could be a tending over years to get the garden that you want. It's not like, I've been in my current property for 3 years, so I'm in process of establishing exactly what I want in all the different areas of my garden. And the prairies are very much like that because they don't happen overnight. They happen over time. And we expanded this year too, and we added another section of it. So my goal is to not have any grass. That's my vision. No grass, no mowing needed. So we're headed there. And then there's the forest garden. So I have the back corner of my property right now. We've cut everything back. I need to get back in there and start doing what we call sheet mulching to cut off the weeds. And so I'm tending, and I've planted some things back there, but I'm also ready to build the soil and start to prepare that. Eventually, I would like that to be a medicinal herb sanctuary. There's an organization called United Plant Savers, and they actually are set up to protect at-risk and endangered medicinal plants, which for many reasons medicinal plants are endangered, especially the ones that we use the roots for medicine. And so United Plant Savers has a list on their website. If you are interested in this, I would encourage you to visit their website. I'm not sure exactly if it's unitedplantsavers.com or .org, but one of those. And they have a lot of resources and materials, and for a nominal fee you can become a member and get a newsletter, etc. But you can look at their at-risk and endangered list without becoming a member, and you can learn about their work because they protect the plants that are heavily leaned on in the herbal marketplace, because that's something that puts plants at risk. And they encourage people to grow forest gardens. So we can grow things like ginseng and golden seal and these understory plants that are medicinal. Hepatica, which isn't utilized a whole lot anymore, but it's a nice understory. Bloodroot, plants like this that are more understory plants and forest garden plants. So I'm in the process. My corner, this is actually just an example. It's not from my property because my forest garden is in process. It's not exactly the way I want it yet. But my goal is to become a sanctuary for the United Plant Savers, where I'm protecting and holding space and providing an educational spot for people to learn about those plants. So that's what a forest garden can look like. And of course, tending that eventually will be a matter of going in there and making sure it gets that the wild plants get mulched, that some of the more assertive, I don't like to label plants with bad names, but some of the more assertive plants you can keep at bay. Now as I said earlier, I harvest a lot of the weedy plants. Like one of the examples in the forest garden would be garlic mustard. It's quite abundant, but it's edible, so I don't really worry too much about it because I harvest it, I make pesto with it, and I'll talk some about that next month when we talk about putting up herbs. But some of the ones that come up are, we can utilize them. I have Dame's Rocket in that area abundantly, and those flowers are edible. So you can see how, I'm just going to take a sip of something to drink. When you talk, you get dehydrated. So you can see, like, I'm creating this forest garden, but I'm also harvesting what's there and utilizing those as herbs. A friend of mine had a really fun idea that maybe garlic mustard would make a good insect repellent. So she made a bug repellent out of garlic mustard. I was like, isn't that a great idea? Because it's so abundant, we could make an insect repellent from it. So again, you would tend a forest garden differently because those are plants that like shade. You certainly wouldn't put them in the middle of your, sunny herb garden. And sometimes people don't think about those as herbs. So when we hear herbs, we usually think sage and rosemary and things like that. But I'm talking about both culinary, edible herbs and medicinal herbs. And there's a resource page in this PowerPoint that you'll be able to take a look at. And that has a whole bunch of books that talk about growing herbs in different ecosystems. And one of them is focused on forest gardening. So you can check that out if you're really interested in this concept of forest gardening and possibly, becoming a United Plant Saver sanctuary. Because the more of us that do that, the more those plants will be protected, people become more aware of them, and learn that you can grow them rather than wild harvest them. Because one of the stressors is people are going out into forested areas and over wildcrafting these plants. So ginseng, golden seal, and the American ginseng is one that Wisconsin is the third largest exporter in the world. And that's problematic because people are growing that plant now, but it's been over wild harvested. You're hard pressed to find that plant in the wild anymore because it's been over foraged. So another place is in container gardening, and I have large containers in my garden. I purchased these boxes, and it was really fun because I realized that I could purchase these at a really good rate for less than I could build a garden box. So I bought a bunch of them, and it's really nice because we mulch in between, and then we can grow in the boxes. And growing things, it's for ease of harvesting and picking. These make it really nice to grow certain things in them. And so when you're container gardening, that's a whole nother thing that you need to pay attention to. How do you build the soil in the container, and how do you, keep unwanted plants from coming into the container? And you want to mulch it because you want to keep it moist. And so there's all these things that you want to do to make sure that large container stays moist and wet. And the past 2 years, last year it was so dry, it was very hard to keep these wet. So I've considered putting a drip line system in, and I'm still contemplating that. I've never had to do that before, but our climate is changing. So when you're tending the herb garden, one of the things you really have to do is observe. And observing over time gives you information, because I've never had to do anything like that before because it's been easy to water. And usually we get rain periodically enough that, you know, things get watered and it's not problematic. But that's changing here. And even we had rain last night, but a couple days ago there was rain in the surrounding areas, but my property didn't get rain, and because it was so hot, the soil just dried up really fast. So you really have to watch what's happening and then make some choices based on that. So I can give you tips, but also you have to observe your system. And that's true. Permaculture is an approach to farming, small scale farming. You can upscale it, but most people are doing small scale backyard permaculture farming. And you really have, one of the tenets of that model is to watch and observe and then make choices based on what you're seeing. And that's just really wise, because everybody's property, even if you live down the block from me, is going to be a little different. Even the top of my property is different than the lower part of my property. And so I can see the difference there too. So that's just a little bit about ecosystems and habitats. And of course, there's lots of other ecosystems and habitats. I just wanted to show you a few that I'm working with right now. You could live in an area where there's more wetlands, which I don't have that on my property. If you have a pond, you're going to have a whole different ecosystem. Or if you live in northern part of Wisconsin, you're going to have sandy soil. And, I've had students who are like, you can grow things that I absolutely can't grow. And, vice versa. So it's really interesting to just look at what you have and what you're working with. So another thing when we're tending is to fertilize. It's a really good idea to fertilize your plants. And I, of course, don't utilize any chemical fertilizers. I like to use the plants. And there's actually a tradition in biodynamic farming and gardening where they make these, what they call preps, and they make them out of plants. And two of their main plants that they utilize are Comfrey and Nettle, which are two plants we utilize a lot in herbalism for making infusions, for healing, all different, aspects for nutrition. And so the vitamin and mineral content of Nettle and Comfrey is really significant. It's super amazing. So one of the first herbs that we put in the preps are stinging nettle. Some people might have heard of stinging nettle. Some people might feel cautious around stinging nettle. But it's a really nutritious plant. And as you can see on my slide here, it's high in, so anything that's high in nitrogen, and a lot of these very green plants are high in nitrogen. I mentioned earlier that we have red clover in the prairie. Red clover literally fixes nitrogen in the soil. So that's what it does. But some of these other greener plants like stinging nettle and comfrey actually add nitrogen to the soil. And then if you have red clover there or some other pea, it's actually pea plants. Red clover is in the pea family or the Fabaceae family. They help to fix nitrogen in the soil. So you want to do that. You really need to work on your soil always. That's something you just always want to be tending. So to make these preps, you just put the plant in a bucket. This is a simple method. Some people on big farms have like big aerated drums and you do all this fancy stuff. But on a small scale, you can just take your green plants, cut them up. So you could cut up stinging nettle, and then your next one you would cut up comfrey, and you cut them up and you put them in a bucket and you pour water on top of them. And to aerate them, you just stir it like a couple times a day. You come along and you give a stir and you just move along. And you're basically creating a green manure. And that is going to get kind of stinky because it's going to start to ferment. And you want that. Manure doesn't smell good, right? Well, rabbit manure. I put rabbit manure in my garden, so that smells okay. But most manure doesn't smell great. So you make this green manure, and it starts to ferment, and it smells fermented. And so then you actually can strain it, and then you can put it on the garden.
How long?
What's that?
How long?
Until it starts to smell. So it depends. Like if it's hotter, like the past couple of days, it's going to go a lot faster. So generally, though, 3 to 5 days, maybe up to 7 days if it's cooler out. So it's just gonna. It's like any fermentation process. If it's hot, it's going to speed up really fast. So when it starts to just smell off, then you're like, okay, it's ready to go. And the nettle and the comfrey are specifically going to give a lot of vitamins and minerals and nitrogen. And then there are other plants that you can add as well. And alfalfa is one, and that adds more nitrogen and other nutrients. Horsetail adds silica, which is really a mineral that's really good, and other nutrients as well. And willow actually adds a growth factor. So if you add willow actually promotes growth. You can actually use willow to root other plants because it has a rooting hormone in it. And so it'll encourage growth. So that's a good thing to put in there. It's not going to do the nitrogen thing in the soil, but it's going to promote the growth of your plants. So your plants are going to be hardier. And willow grows everywhere. I mean, there's a willow that grows in the ditches everywhere, and I just call it ditch willow. And you can harvest that and add that to your preps, and that'll help too. And then, I have comfrey in here again. Chicory is another one, and dandelion are both really helpful, and the whole plant. So you'd be adding, dig up the root. And most people, if you're weeding and you're digging up dandelion and chicory, great, put them in your prep. Instead of disliking the plant or feeling frustrated with it. Of course, I eat dandelion and chicory, but another thing to do with them is to put them in your prep. And like I said, you let it sit, and then you sprinkle it on the garden. So you're going to strain the plants out. You can put it in. You could put it in a sprayer if that feels easier, if you have a lot of areas to cover. But you can put it in a little watering can if you have a small area, And, you can make any amount of this. You could make a quart, you could make 5 gallons, just depending on how much area you have to cover. So these green manure preps have, like I said, they're used in biodynamic farming. And biodynamic farming has incredible results on producing vegetables and herbs and other plants that are really significantly healthy without chemicals. And so this is one way. The stronger the plants, the less likely they're going to get stressed out by pests and that kind of stuff. So in building the soil, again, we're looking here at a green manure. We're growing oat straw here, and I grow oat straw for its herbal benefit. The botanical name is Avena sativa, and oats actually are nourishing to the nervous system. They're helpful. They have a calcium component, so they help to add calcium to the diet. So we actually grow this, dry it, and then we make infusions with it, and we drink it. And then once we cut it, oats are also a cover crop. So this is, again, acting as a green manure. This is another area. I have 2 of these areas right now growing oats because we utilize a lot of them. And then when we cut it back, we'll cut the aerial parts when it goes to seed. And then we will till the root and just the growth at the very bottom back into the soil, and again it's a green manure. And then we'll plant something else there, and we'll be planting a lot of prairie type plants here because I'm trying to remove grass from my environment. I think it's such a waste of space. I always want food and medicine in every corner and beauty. I love flowers too. I think beauty counts for something, right? I just don't think grass is beautiful. But these oats are beautiful, aren't they? They're really gorgeous. This is about how tall they are right now. They'll get, quite a bit taller before we harvest them. We'll harvest them when they go to seed. And then again, we'll be tending the soil. And sometimes I do plant a second oat crop if I have enough time in the season. If I don't, then I'll put something else in there, and I will look at something that maybe needs cold stratification over the winter, and then I'll let that sit over the winter, and then it'll sprout in the springtime. So I haven't decided yet what I'm going to put in the 2 oat plants, but something along those lines. Okay, so mulching. So this is really important for a couple reasons. To mulch to keep moisture in. Mulch is really good at that. And like I said, it's been really dry, so it's hard to keep moisture in. So the more mulch you can put on, leaving bare open soil exposes, the soil just dries out really fast. And so I've actually even found it's better to leave weeds if you're not going to mulch, because they help to hold moisture in. Like, we have lots of lamb's quarters growing, and I love lamb's quarters. It's considered weedy, but it's a great green. You can cook it, you can put it in salads. So even leaving those weeds to hold that moisture in can be a kind of a living mulch, if you will. But in these photos, on the one where my fruit trees are, we've actually mulched with straw. And not only have we mulched, we've actually layered mushroom spores in the straw. And then we've also planted comfrey plants around the trees. And so one of the things that happens with the comfrey plants in permaculture, people have started to introduce a concept called chop and drop. And so what you do is you plant the comfrey, which again is high in nitrogen and other vitamins and minerals that'll help the soil, and you cut it back and you let it fall on the ground and just decompose right there on the ground. And it comes back like multiple, like it doesn't stop. Yeah, you're shaking your head. But it's a great thing. You just keep cutting it back. It drops, and then it comes back. You drop it again, and then it contributes to the health of your soil. And I'll tell you, my fruit trees this year, because we've done this the past couple of years, are beautiful. They look better than they ever have because we mulch them. The mushrooms also contribute to soil development, the mycelium that grows there, which is the root system of the mushrooms. I mean, we do eat the mushrooms. That's a nice byproduct. But what we're really trying to do is build the soil and hold moisture in. So you can do that anywhere. You can do it with herbs as long as that whatever's above it provides some shade. And I noticed one of my small fruit trees actually didn't make it last year, but we had put this mulch under it. And there's Creeping Charlie that's a little higher than other places. And the mushrooms are under the Creeping Charlie, using that for shade. I was like, this is so funny. I picked some mushrooms from under there today, and I just was getting a kick out of how they use anything for shade that's available. So then back to the spiral garden, I brought that back here again. And on the outside of the spiral garden is, we put some wood mulch down. Actually, I have to give my apprentice Sid credit. She did this. And so we put mulch around. And we originally put straw mulch in the spiral garden itself. And then we went and put some wood chips in there now. And so the wood chips serve a couple purposes. They keep the other unwanted plants at bay, and they help to hold in moisture, and then as it breaks down, it contributes to the soil. So you see, you're constantly, everything you're presenting is contributing and tending, because that's our topic for tonight, is tending. So all of these things you're doing it's gonna tend to the herb garden. It's gonna tend to it for this year, but it's also gonna tend to it for future years. And so, like, I'm constantly thinking about that as I'm cultivating these areas and developing them. Oh, that kind of came up funky, but so this is a garden bed where we put mushroom logs. So I grow shiitake mushrooms, and these are old logs from about 6 or 7 years ago that really don't have any more food for the mushrooms, so they rarely produce mushrooms anymore. So again, Sid did this. She's learning all about this. We took it and we put the mushroom logs, and we framed the beds with the mushroom logs. And every once in a while a mushroom will pop up and you're like, oh goody, that's nice. But the other thing is, those mushroom logs, again, they're going to break down and add and contribute to the soil health. So you can see, like, everything we're doing is breaking things down, contributing to the health of the soil. And this bed has calendula in it, which is a edible and medicinal flower. And one thing I'll say about this, actually, I have calendula listed later because I'm going to go over a couple plant-specific herbs in a little bit and talk about how to tend each of those herbs. Because you've got your habitat tending, and then each herb has different requirements or needs for tending. So you have to kind of think about that too. Like, what does this herb need? How is it going to flourish? Some herbs, flourish no matter what, and they find their own way. But some herbs do need, some tending, and the calendula, I do like to tend to it. Comfrey. So that's what we're going to do next. Actually, let me back up for a second here. Does anybody have any questions? Because that first part of this is about habitat. It's about tending the beds. That's kind of an overall framework. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions around that? Yes.
Yeah, I had some questions. So I love your natural approach to we're not worried about the weeds, and if they're here, we'll eat them some. But how do you keep them from really taking over and choking out the plants? Is that monitoring and picking at certain times or?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's multi-layered, like everything else, right? And one thing, so I'm on the property I'm on right now. I've been there 3 years, and I'm finally seeing more biodiversity. And even though your short-term goal might be to minimize those plants, like Creeping Charlie I could be a Creeping Charlie farmer. My land loves Creeping Charlie. And so I'm trying to appreciate Creeping Charlie. I too think that could be a bug repellent as well.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of products to make with it. But it's also edible. It's a mint. The bees love it. So one thing is I try not to hate plants. And a lot of people do get really disgruntled. So I've done a couple things with that plant. One is I've looked at what other plants do well around it. And don't get discouraged, because that's the thing is some plants will get discouraged by that. So those plants, I might need to take care of it in that section of the garden more assertively than another part. Stinging nettle seems okay with it. My elecampane, which is a medicinal herb that I utilize the root, it doesn't seem bothered by Creeping Charlie at all. So I kind of think of it that way. Now, one section of my garden, because I'm experimenting as well, I solarized, and I put down black plastic and put garden beds on top of that. And there's no Creeping Charlie there. None. Now, I'm not out to eradicate Creeping Charlie, but I am out to allow the plants that won't do well with it to have a space. So that's kind of my thinking. Now, the other thing is we do something called sheet mulching. And actually, so this is good you ask this right now, because we need to cover up the cardboard. Do you see the edges, the cardboard? So, but this is good that you asked this, and it's a good example. What we do is called sheet mulching, and you put down cardboard on the beds, and that keeps the weeds from getting sunlight and being able to, grow. So we put that down, and then we put the soil and the mulch on top of that. And with the calendula, we planted right through the cardboard here, and we need to add a little more mulch and soil around it. But that's going to keep some of the unwanted plants in that area at bay. So there's all types of strategies, and of course we do pull them as well, and pull them so the other plants can get a head start, because that's what happens is they going to take over, and we want to give those other plants a head start. So does that answer the question? Mm-hmm. It's kind of, I really think we have to think of this as a broader, more long-term. And the biodiversity, it's been really fun. Even in my grassy lawn, when I moved to my property, there were mostly dandelions and grass. And now I'm looking around and I'm like, oh, this year there's white clover, and that wasn't there before. And so when you invite biodiversity, then you're not going to have a monocrop of assertive plants, because there's going to be more cooperation on your land and in your gardens. And that's how I like to think about it. Any other questions?
I do have another question. So I was curious if you would talk more about, kind of allowing Dame's Rocket and garlic mustard to coexist, and you're clearly monitoring it very carefully. How do you explain that to folks who are just like, no, it needs to go all immediately, forever, it's a bad word, and all of that?
Right. Well, I mean, I talk about shifting our mindset because we obviously, the environment is in trouble. And we have the biggest indicator of that are the bees. The bees are in trouble, and a lot of it comes from chemicals. And so when we spray chemicals in our gardens to eradicate these plants, that results in loss of pollinators that are really important to our whole food supply, actually. And so I usually try to share information about those kind of things and say, you know, we probably want to start shifting our mindset. And I go every year to the Midwest Organic Farming Conference when they have it. They didn't have it for a couple of years, but they're starting it back up again. And it's really fun to go and talk to organic farmers. And a lot of the older organic farmers I meet there, first of all, their families organically farmed because we haven't been chemically farming for that long, really. So we see that there's some detriment to it. And these farmers will get on board with chemical farming and then they'll go back to their old traditional farming ways. And I've talked to a lot of these older farmers and they're like, yeah, we want the hedgerows and we want the bees. We need these things. So it's really about shifting and just starting with your own little corner and looking at it and seeing it and learning that plants are edible. Like a lot of people don't know Damon's rocket flowers are edible. And if you learn that they're edible, that kind of changes things. And a lot of people are interested in wild foraging right now. And so that is a lead in for people to, you know, you can say to people, hey, garlic mustard is edible. We can make a pesto with this. Or we can pull up the whole plant and make an infused vinegar that's going to be really nice in our salad dressings. So those are the kind of things I live that. So I think I'm a living example of how we can start to incorporate these things and bring them in. So those are some of my thoughts about it. And I sing a dandelion song to people just to cheer them up. So,
so then just for folks who are watching this at home, we do have the chat enabled now. And if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. If you don't see the chat, refresh your page and it should pop up on the right-hand side. All right.
Great. Okay, so this section I'm going to talk about specific plants. And so yes, just ask questions if you have them. The first plant I'll talk about is Comfrey. And we've talked about it as a living mulch, as a fertilizer, and it's also a healing and nutritious plant. It can be utilized for topical application. We utilize it for infusions. And so tending Comfrey from that vantage point in the garden, so I don't chop and drop all my Comfrey. I actually harvest some of it and dry it and utilize it for infusions. I also harvest it and put it in oil, and I'll talk more about this in the next session about exactly how to do this. But I'll wilt it and then I'll put it in oil and I'll make lotions and things like that. And so tending this is pretty easy. But what I do is when the flowers look really nice like this and the bees are on it, then I know the plant is ready to harvest. So I'll cut it back and it'll grow again. So tending Comfrey is one of those plants that you want to keep cutting back throughout the year. And you'll get multiple harvests from it. And that's how you tend it. If you ignore it and you just let it die back, it's going to be unhappy and you're not going to get as many harvests from it. So that's how you tend this plant. And I always think it's interesting to look at the specific plants and how you tend them. Yes?
How many times do you cut it back per season?
It really varies.
Yeah.
I mean, really, I've already cut it back like 2-3 times. So, I mean, many times. Yeah. If I just want to keep, and that's why the chop and drop thing works really well, because you're chopping and dropping continuously. So, yeah.
Cool.
Calendula is an herb that we utilize for skincare. It's also utilized in a tea, and it's also an edible flower. Tending this is plucking flower heads. We ideally pluck them every day because the more you pluck, the more they grow. And so we put them in baskets and we wilt them, and then they too go in oil, or they dry for teas, or we make alcohol tincture extracts out of them. So plucking them every day is the way. So it's a ritual in the garden. We just go out there, pluck the flowers, bring them into our drying shack. And then the other way to tend them is they're an annual. So, and they're what we call a self-sowing annual. So the other way to tend them is to let them go, some of them go to seed. So I'll pluck a lot of them, but then come later on in the season, I'll let some go to seed so that they'll replant themselves. And if they're happy where they are, if you've really built the soil and they love it there, they will sprout next year. They'll go, over winter, and then they'll sprout next year, and you'll just have this continual bed of calendula. And it's beautiful. It's orange and yellow, and it's really pretty in the garden. Lemon balm, or Melissa officinalis, is one I like to grow. This plant is funny and quirky, like some herbs. When you plant it, it usually decides it likes it somewhere else, so it'll move. And then you're like, okay, I guess I'm okay with that. Usually I am. It's a mint, but it's not as assertive as peppermint and spearmint. It's usually pretty friendly to other plants. But again, cutting it back, it's a mint, and it'll grow back several times. So the way to tend this is when you get it gets pretty hardy like this, then you just cut it back. You can either dry it, or you can put it up in a tincture, or even oil for topical application, because it's a really incredible healing plant. So it's super easy to grow, and it smells. Lemon balm is its perfect name because it smells so lemon. Anybody grow this? Yeah, it smells so good, doesn't it? It totally does. It's so funny to watch the plants that do that. Like, nope, you're like, I put it there, but now it's there.
So do you cut it down before it flowers?
I cut it back. I usually cut it back a couple times, depending on what I'm making, and then I might let it go to flower later on. And then again, a lot of the herbs you can do this with. At some point, let them go to seed. And lemon balm will plant itself all over your garden. And it's really not, like, I don't consider it as assertive as other plants. It seems to play well with others. So.
Yeah. I have lemon balm, and I've always been afraid of killing it. Which maybe I just shouldn't be.
No. It's a myth.
Yeah, okay.
You don't need to be afraid.
Okay.
Yes, but let it get hardy. Like, don't cut it back when it's young. Like, let it get pretty hardy and bushy, because I think that's one thing. And I think I do this sometimes because I'm so anxious early in the year to utilize my herbs, and I'll utilize them when they're still real tiny, and then they don't have a chance to flourish. And I think I've done that in the past with lemon balm. So let it get really hardy, and then you can cut it back, and it's not going to go anywhere. So. All right, so skullcap, this is one, we planted a whole bed of this recently. It's an herb. It's in the mint family as well. So plants in the mint family are usually pretty vigorous. This is a self-sowing annual. We utilize this as a relaxing nervine and mild pain reliever in herbalism. And so I plant a whole bed of it because I end up utilizing a lot of this, not personally for myself, but for my clients and other people. I don't seem to have a lot of pain, but so that's good. But a lot of people in our world do, and so and it can help with sleep as well. It can be real relaxing. So, and it's pretty. It's got a really pretty flower, and I like growing it in the garden. So when it flowers, this one, pretty much you get one harvest out of it, and then I let some of it go to seed, and then it'll self-sow and it'll come back. So, but it's different than lemon balm, for example, where usually you get a couple harvests. Definitely different than Comfrey, because it's pretty much a one-time harvest when it's flowering. And I usually let the bees go on it for a little while, and then I'll harvest it because the bees really like it. So you can see that the different plants have different needs, and so you have to get to know them. It's like getting to know a friend. Like, what does my friend need? And it might be different in your garden, but these are generalities that I think are applicable to most gardens that I'm sharing with you. So chamomile, this is a really wonderful herb. This is on the left is a bed that we planted recently. That's what it looks like now. I took another picture of the flower just so you could see it, but mine's not flowering yet. And when this flowers, you harvest the flowers, This is in the Asteraceae family. It's actually a hardy perennial. It'll come back if it's really happy. It'll come back year after year. And again, you can let this go to seed also, and the beds will become really flourishing. And chamomile, of course, most people know it's a relaxing, calming, again, nervine. But there are other things you can do with chamomile, and I'll talk about that next month. It's a wonderful herb for many, many things. Digestive support, for example. So, and here we harvested a bunch of stinging nettle recently. And this is Sid, who's one of my apprentices, and she was happy to go out there. We went to this area. We actually wild harvested this nettle, and it was acres of nettle everywhere you could see. And nettle is an incredible vegetable. It's a wonderful, nourishing herb. It's healing to the lungs and the kidneys. It's just one of those herbs. It helps to relieve seasonal allergies. But on the left over here is a small patch in my garden. And so I like to have it in my garden because we do eat it as a vegetable as well. And then on the right, you see we have it drying. And that's stuff I'll talk about next time, is about how to dry herbs. But tending nettle in the garden, it's pretty assertive. It likes being in the garden. It holds its own with Creeping Charlie, so I'm happy about that. And it spreads. So I have a bed where I'm allowing it to spread. I want it to spread because to me it's a vegetable. To some people it's annoying, but to me it's a vegetable. So I'm growing it. And then Elecampane is called Inula Helenium. It's a aster plant that gets about this tall. So tending this, the first thing is I chose where to plant it in the back of my garden so it wouldn't overshadow some of the herbs in the front, that where it would shade them if I didn't put it in the back. And because it's tall, it looks really beautiful when it flowers in the back of the garden. And so choosing where your plants are is tending, because you have to think about where they are in relationship to other plants and where you're going to put them. This plant also does fine with Creeping Charlie. It doesn't seem to mind it. And we dig up the root of this plant in the fall. So it's really beautiful. The bees love it. So it acts as a, for pollinators in the garden. And then in the fall, we dig up the root. We take some of the root, we plant the crown back, and it doesn't miss a beat, and it grows right back the next year. So this is a very hardy plant. It's a medicinal respiratory plant. We make cough syrups and lozenges and different things out of it. It's very mentholatum like, so it's a really wonderful one to grow. And I'm going to talk. We were talking about roses before we started today, and roses are something I like to cultivate. I grow heirloom and rugosa roses. I don't grow fancy roses that are more susceptible to pests. So I grow varieties that are old world varieties that you don't have to worry too much about pests, since I'm not utilizing any chemicals. And I eat rose petals, I eat rose hips, I drink rose hip tea. This is, to me, it's a medicinal plant. It's in the Rosaceae family, which is apples are in that family. The fruit is just like an apple. It's really high in pectin. You can make jellies with it, etc. And they're pretty easy to care for, these heirloom varieties. I know a lot of people ask me about fancier varieties that are more vulnerable to pests, and I just don't grow those because it's one thing if you're going to have an organic system, then there's some things you probably don't want to grow. And the fancy varieties of roses would be one. Elderberry, sambucus, there's different species. But it grows wild all over this area, but I grow named varieties, so I get a little bit bigger of a berry. And they do really well in the sun. They actually grow in ditches. So I look around my property and I'm like, what's similar to a ditch? And so let's plant them there. And so I'm creating hedgerows with these, which is really nice. And we've done the layering with mushrooms underneath the elderberries as well, and that works really well because I'm trying to get the soil to be more lively. And then I've had some wild ones just show up on my property, and then I start tending those. So And I love mulberries. I know some people get upset with them, but that's another plant that shows up wild on my property, and I tend it. I mulch it, I trim it, cut it back, and enjoy the mulberry. So I'm happy when things like that show up. Wine cap. Yeah, have you had those? They're delicious. I love them. So yeah, they grow fast. Yeah, you have to harvest them right away. So we check every day. We walk around, but they're great for under the trees, like for building the soil. They're like the perfect thing. And then there are, I'm trying to think of the name of the other mushroom. Agaricus, I think it is. That actually, and I haven't planted those yet, but I'm going to. My friend who at mushroom farms, she told me they grow really well with tomatoes. So I'm going to do the same thing under my tomatoes. I'm going to get some of those spores and plant them under my tomatoes. I mean, mushrooms really should be a part of every ecosystem, and our systems are so devoid of mushrooms because, of the chemicals and the tilling that we've done. We've destroyed the root system of the mushrooms, basically. What we eat of a mushroom is the fruit, and there's all this mycelium underneath its root system that helps other plants and talks to other plants. And so the more good mushrooms you have there, the more mycelium, the healthier everything's going to be. So just can't have enough. So we've got prairie plants. I had mentioned those earlier. We have echinacea. We have bee balm. I utilize echinacea, the root or the cone for medicine. When I'm growing it, I typically like to utilize the cone so I don't have to dig up the root because I don't want to kill the plant. And this isn't like elecampane. Elecampane, you can dig up the root and plant the crown back and it grows back, but echinacea doesn't. So you can utilize the cone, and you can tincture that or dry it and make tea or make a tincture from it. And it's boosting to the immune system. So it's a really important herb in my herb garden, and it's great for pollinators. I mean, you'll see butterflies and bees and just everybody on it. And then bee balm, which is on the left-hand side, Monarda didyma. This is the red one, but I also I don't plant the wild bee balm. Monarda fistulosa just shows up. And so that plant is highly valued for its medicinal properties. It has antispasmodic properties for the lungs. It's also a good spice. You can dry it and use it in your food as a spice. And it's great for pollinators too, right? It's called bee balm. And then hummingbirds love the bee balms as well. If you aren't aware of that, plant a bunch of them and you'll get lots of hummingbirds coming to them as well. So tending these is pretty easy. They're in the mint family, the bee balms, and they, just develop large stands. Sometimes you want to more contain them, if they're taking up too much space. But they usually do well when they're planted with other plants like the other prairie plants. So those are some of the plants I chose to talk about. There's obviously, you could talk for a long time about a whole bunch of other plants, but those are just some I pulled out of my garden that I'm working with extensively, and there's lots more. Here's a resource list, and I pulled a couple different things. Growing and Using Herbs Successfully is an older book, but it's really good. It's like such a good classic. It's one of those books that you pull out and, it's all tattered because you look stuff up in it. That's one of those books, and you can find that one pretty easily used. So I highly recommend that. And you may even have that at the library. I'm not sure, but I'm sure you can get it if you don't have it. The Organic Medicinal Herb Farmer. This is a great book that came out a couple years ago. These are a couple that are growing herbs for the medicinal herb industry, and they talk a lot about tending. How do you tend to these different plants, and how do you tend to them more on a larger scale? So if that's what you're interested in, I would highly recommend that book. I'm growing on a small to medium scale. I'm not growing, and I never will grow on a large scale. I'm more interested in the biodiversity you can see, and then creating fields of a plant for the herb industry. That's not really what I'm doing. But this book can help you if you want to go in that direction. Raised bed gardening is really, really helpful if you're not doing raised bed gardening, or if you have a small space. Raised beds are just so great, and herbs are really, really friendly to raised beds, and that's one of the things that a lot of people ask me about if they have a small space. So you can see I'm doing it even though I have a larger space. But I started buying those boxes when I was renting a home and I had a smaller space, and it made a lot of sense. And then I brought them into this environment because I like the height for harvesting. I don't have to get as far down on the ground, and as I get older, it's a little more tricky sometimes. And I can really keep an eye on things more easily, and pulling things out is easier. So I really like raised bed gardening for herbs. I think it's a great strategy. The Medicinal Forest Garden. So this is a book that focuses on those forest herbs and those herbs that are kind of unusual to think of as farming or gardening, but you do need to garden those. And if you have a shady, this is another question I get a lot in these programs. What do I do in my shady areas? You create a forest garden, even if it's a small shady area. You can plant things like wild ginger and hepatica and bloodroot and trilliums, and you can do all those understory plants that love that environment or that ecosystem. Blue cohosh, which is one of our medicinal herbs that's utilized extensively, likes that environment. Black cohosh likes it as well. So there's lots of different herbs that like shady spaces, and so you can create that even if you have a small shady space. Strictly Medicinal. So this is a catalog, but I recommend it to people. You can just order it for free. The person who owns this company, he specializes in growing seed for the medicinal herb world. And he has so much great information about growing herbs that the catalog is like a book. It's such a valuable resource, and it's free. And of course, he would love it if you bought seeds from him and plants, but you don't have to. And he's just very knowledgeable, and I cannot believe how much information he has packed in that catalog. So order that catalog, and I think you'll really be happy you did, and you'll enjoy it. And the same person, his name's Rico Check, he owns that company. He wrote these other two books, Growing at-Risk Medicinal Plants and the Medicinal Herb Grower Volume 1. I'm imagining he's going to come out with Volume 2, so we'll anticipate that. But these are really good books. And Rico has been growing herbs for 50 years. I mean, he knows cultivation, he knows tending, he knows the medicinal properties, and that's his specialty, is on medicinal herbs. So I highly recommend that if that's what your interest is in the medicinal realm. So I'll open it up for questions and see if anybody has anything you'd like me to review or respond to. Anything?
I have a question.
Okay.
So I struggle with knowing when to water. And sometimes I don't realize it until it's too late.
That you need to water.
That I need to water. And it's just, I don't know, just be like wilty, flat on the ground, very dramatic. And a lot of times it comes back after I water it, but I know that puts a lot of stress on the plant. And it's harder, and So what are some telltale signs before it's too late?
Well, you can easily put your finger in the beds. And if it's dry down below, I mean, that's the simplest thing. But you can also get meters and stick meters in the ground, and but your finger's a meter. So that's the easiest thing. And then, I don't think, if it hasn't rained for a day or two, most herbs would appreciate a little bit of water. And I was noticing the other day, I watered later in the day instead of early, and I was like, I should have watered in the morning. Like, if you've had a couple days of heat, it's a good idea not to have the plants go through a whole nother day of really hot heat. Like, go out there in the morning and water so that they have that water resource during the day. Because if you're going to look at and next week we're going to have some 90 degree, scorcher days, those would be really good days, both days, to get up and water in the morning. And, and then, after that, if the temperatures cool down a little bit, just start checking. But when it's that hot, just water, because the plants just really need it. And you can't, it's hard. Vegetables are a little different. With herbs, it's hard to overwater them. So herbs are way more forgiving than vegetables. I grow tomatoes because I love tomatoes. But, I'm probably not the best vegetable gardener of other vegetables because they do need a more consistent response. But herbs are fairly forgiving. And they tolerate overwatering a little better than, because with like tomatoes, they really need you to more consistently water. And like I said earlier, I'm considering putting a drip system in because of the drought conditions we're starting to see more and more in this region, which I had never thought about before. But then I would put it on a timer and run those drip lines. And the reason for the drip lines that I think is I'm kind of convincing myself it might be a good idea, it'll more consistently water everything than overhead watering. Because overhead watering sometimes, and if it's been really hot, the ground, even if you water, the ground doesn't even absorb it. I had that a lot last year.
It just evaporates.
Yeah, so then, you're kind of not even accomplishing what you want. So, but I think watering in the morning, if you're not doing that, I think that's a better strategy, even if it is overhead watering. So hopefully that helps some.
Yeah.
Anything else anybody has?
Limited space, too many ditch lilies.
Too many ditch lilies? They take up a lot of space.
And they're aggressive. They're persistent.
They're persistent, sort of, yes.
So, I love these. I love, it's a small space, so I'm limited on space. I already know the ecosystem there, but boy, doing a woodland garden would be just a joke in that area that is shady to go with it.
Well, I think if you sheet mulch, and or
mulched with black rubber for 14 months, and then took it off, and I just got done mowing.
Okay.
Because they came back,
They came back again.
I think their tubers can hold a lot of moisture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do. Yeah, tubers do.
Really.
And they don't mind drought conditions.
No,
So then, I start to think to myself, okay, so what is their purpose?
I know.
And how can I work with them? Because they're probably not totally going to go away. So you just start to, think and shift that. And when you have a small space, then you can start to think about, how can I stack things? How can I maybe bring in some raised beds around them? Or, I think you just have to get creative. And, they could provide shade for mushrooms. So.
I've been thinking about that. That was what I was thinking 2 days ago. Okay, I'm not going to babble.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's an old schoolhouse.
Right.
So it's supposed to stand around.
And they've probably been there for a
They've
long
been there
time.
for a long
Yeah.
time. And they're everywhere. And they're
Yeah.
neighbors.
Yeah.
And it's just,
Yes. And the daylilies, you don't want to eat a lot of them, but they are edible,
yeah.
so you can eat them. So that's always a
one needs to do
yeah. You can't eat a lot of them, but yeah. All right.
We don't have any questions coming in from the chat,
Okay.
and we're at time.
Okay.
So,
Great. Well, let me just say that hopefully people will come back next month. We'll talk a lot more about what do you do with these herbs? How do you put them up? How do you prepare them? And, how can you make medicine? How can you make some, tasty food for later or for now? And so we'll be doing that. So hopefully we'll see people next month. What is the date? Do you remember? I don't remember the date.
July?
It's in July.
Let me look it up real quick.
Okay, we'll let you know what the date is. So you can mark it on your calendar now, and we'll have lots of inspiration for how to utilize herbs in your life.
July 14th.
July 14th, same time, same place, right? 6:30.
Yep.
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 All right. Well, thanks everybody. Have a good night.